Okay, going over 7 of the most badass women. Yeah, so let's get straight into this. Kushalan, I think that's how you pronounce her name, Mongolian war princess. In the 13th century, when Khans ruled Central Asia, and you couldn't go 10 minutes without some Genghis, Kublai, or Mongki trying to take over your steppe, when women were well versed in badassery. The society where skills on horse and with bow and arrow was an important than brute strength. Mongol women made just as stout herds and warriors as their men. One woman, however, had the combination of both skills and might. Her name was Kutulan, and she was not only a devastated cavalry woman, but one of the greatest wrestlers the Mongols have ever seen. Born around 1260 to the ruler of Swat, of what is now Western Mongolia and China. She helped her father repel repeatedly the invading hordes commanded by the mighty Kublai Khan, who also happened to be her great uncle. Her favorite tactic was to seize an enemy soldier and ride off with him. The explorer Marco Polo recounted as deftly as a hawk pounces on a bird. Off the battlefield and in the wrestling ring, Kutulan went similarly undefeated. She declared that she wouldn't marry any man who couldn't beat her in a wrestling match. Those who lost had to give her their prized horses. Suffice it to say, Kutulan had a lot of horses, but by the time she was in her 20s and a spinster by Mongol standards, her parents pleaded with her to throw a match with the particularly eligible bachelor. According to Polo, she initially agreed, but once in the ring found herself unable to break the habit of a lifetime and surrender. She overpowered her suitor, who, humiliated, fled. She eventually chose a husband from among her father's men and married him without submitting him to the eventually impossible challenge to out-wrestle her. Nana Asmu, Nigerian scholar. Women, a warning: not leave your homes without good reason. You may go out to seek food or seek education. In Islam is a religious duty to seek knowledge, wrote our second historical lady, Nana Asmu, whose proof that the pen is mightier than the sword, and at least as badass, born the daughter of a powerful ruler in what is now known as northern Nigeria. Nana Asmu, 1793 to 1864, was taught from a young age that God wanted her to learn, and not just her, all women too. Her father, a Qadri Sufi, who believed that sharing knowledge was every Muslim's duty, ensured that she studied the classics in Arabic, Latin, and Greek. By the time her education was completed, she could recite the entire Quran and was fluent in 4 languages. She corresponded with scholars and leaders all over the region. She penned poetry about battles, politics, and divine truth. And when her brother inherited the throne, she became his trusted advisor. She could have settled for being respected for her learning, but instead she was determined to pass it on. Nana Asma'u trained a network of women teachers, the Jaji, who traveled all over the kingdom to educate women who, in turn, would teach others. The Jajis also got to wear what sounds like a kind of amazing balloon-shaped hat, which marked them out of leaders. Their students were known as the Yan Teru, or those who congregated together, the sisterhood. Even today, almost 2 centuries later, the modern-day Jajis continue to educate women, men, and children in Nana's name. Policarpa Salaverry, Colombian revolutionary. La Pola, as she was called during her brief life, was by all accounts daring, sharp-tongued, and defiant. She fought to free her land in what is now known as Colombia from Spain's rule, all while pretending to sit in the corner and sew. She was born sometime around 1790 and grew up aimed rebellion as resistance to the French Empire strengthened across South America. By the time she was moved to Bogota, Sirsa, in 1817, she was determined to play her role, posing as a humble seamstress and house servant. She would offer her services to royal households where she could gather intelligence and pass it on to the guerrillas. I think that's how you say it. Meanwhile, pretending to flirt with soldiers in the royalist army, she'd urge them to desert and join the rebels. Oh, and she was genuinely sewing the whole time. Sewing uniforms for the freedom fighters, that is. She and her network of helpers, it seemed there were several women like her, were eventually discovered. When soldiers came to take her, she kept them engaged in a slanging match while one of her comrades slipped away to burn incriminating letters. She refused to betray the cause and was sentenced to death by firing squad in November 1817. She was dragged into the city's main square to provide an example for anyone with thoughts of rebellion. She harangued the Spanish soldiers so loudly that orders had to be given for the drums to be beaten louder to drown her out. She refused to kneel and had to be shot leaning against a stool. Her final words were reportedly a promise that her death would be avenged. Sure enough, she continued to inspire the revolutionary forces long after her expedition. Qing Shi, Chinese pirate. We don't know much about where Qing Shi came from. We don't know where she was born, when, or even her real name. All we know is that she burst into the public record at the start of the 19th century. She would make it a far more badass place. She first appeared in 1801 when she, then a prostitute aboard one of the Canton's floating brothels, was carried off to marry pirate commander Cheng Yi. Cheng wasn't accustomed to doing much asking, but his lady love had conditions. She wanted equal share in his plunder and say in the pirating business. The husband and wife team was a success, but lasted just 6 years before Qing Yi was killed in a typhoon. At his death, his wife took over his name. Qing Shi means widow of Chang and his fleet. Now at the head of one of Asia's biggest pirate crews, the Red Flag Fleet, Qing Shi revealed herself to be the brains of the operation. Her strength wasn't in sailing, so she put the first mate in charge of the ships, having first instituted one of the strictest pirate codes ever seen before or since, and devoted herself to new ways to get rich on land. Extortion, blackmail, and protecting rackets all proved healthy, if not entirely honorable, sources of income. By 1808, her force had grown so formidable that the Chinese government sent its ships to defeat it. Faced with the Red Flag Fleet's firepower and Chang Shi's inspired naval strategizing, the Armada failed, and as did those subsequently sent by the British and Portuguese navies. Eventually, China's government offered a truce. Just 9 years after she'd negotiated a prenup with her husband-to-be, Chang Shi managed to extract stunningly favorable terms from the emperor. In exchange for disbanding her fleet, she won amnesty for all but a handful of her men. the right for the crew to keep their loot, jobs, and armed forces of any pirate who wanted it, and title of Lady by Imperial decree for herself. She retired to Canton to open her own gambling den, married her second in command, and died a grandmother at the age of 69. Gertrude Bell, British traveler and writer. We could characterize Gertrude Bell as the female Florence of Arabia, if you will, but that doesn't really do her justice. Unlike T.E. Lawrence, now better remembered in movies and adventure stories in real life, well into the century, Miss Bell remained a well-known figure in the country she helped create, Iraq. Born in 1868 to a wealthy industry family in northern England, she excelled in her studies at Oxford. After graduating the first-class modern history degree the university had ever awarded to a woman, she traveled the world twice, became one of the world's most daring mountaineers, taught herself archaeology, and mastered French, German, Arabic, and Persian. Her intimate familiarity with the Middle East, whose deserts she explored and whose most powerful chiefs she knew personally, made her an invaluable recruit to British intelligence when World War I broke out. After the armistice, she became one of the driving forces of British policy in the Middle East. She mapped out the borders of what became Mesopotamia, and ultimately Iraq. She installed the first king, and she supervised who he appointed to his new government. Just days before the government was inaugurated and her first project was complete, Bell was found dead from an overdose of sleeping pills. Whether accidentally or intentional isn't clear. One of her Iraqi colleagues once told her that the people of Baghdad would talk of her for 100 years, to which she responded, "I think they very likely will. By accounts, for better or worse, they have." The Night Witches, Russian World War II fighter pilots. It was their enemies, the Nazis, who gave these women their nickname. Officially, they were the members of the Soviet Air Force's 588th Night Bomberregiment. To the German pilots they fought, however, they were tormentors, harpies, and seemingly supernatural powers of night vision and stealth. Shooting down one of their planes was automatically earn any German soldier the Iron Cross. The legendary 588th was the one of the three all-female Soviet squadrons formed on October 8, 1941, by order of Joseph Stalin. The few hundred women who belonged to them, picked from thousands of volunteers, were the first of any modern military to carry out dedicated combat missions rather than simply provided support. The 80-odd Night Witches had arguably the toughest task of all, flying entirely in the dark and in plywood planes better suited to dust crops with withstanding enemy fire. The pilots developed a technique of switching off their engines and gliding toward the target to enable them to drop off their bombs in near silence. They also flew in threes to take turns drawing out enemy fire while one of the pilots released their charges. It was, quite frankly, awesome. As even their enemies had to admit, we simply couldn't grasp the Soviet airmen that caused us the greatest trouble were, in fact, women. One top German commander wrote in 1942, "These women were feared nothing." Heidi Lamar, Australian inventor. She had a 2-decade career playing in Hollywood movies, but while the rest of her co-stars were sunning themselves, sleeping with each other, or picking up a substance to abuse, Heidi Lamar was coming up with the system of wireless communication that would later form the foundation of cell phones, Wi-Fi, and most of our modern life. That's why one of her extraordinary things about Hedwig Eva Maria Kelsler, as she was born to Jewish parents in Vienna in 1914. Briefly married to a Nazi arms dealer. Again, what? She fled Australia for France and then Britain, where she met Louis B. Mayer and secured a $3,000 a week contract with his MGM studio. In between filming and at the height of World War II, she and a composer, George Antheil, I think that's how you pronounce his last name, came up with the idea of a secret communication system that would randomly manipulate radio frequencies as they traveled between transmitter and receiver, thus encrypting sensitive signals from any would-be interceptors. Their invention, patented in 1941, laid the groundwork for the spread spectrum technology used today as in Wi-Fi, GPS, Bluetooth, and some cell phones. Ever inventive, Lamar also came up with soluble cubes that would turn water into something like Coca-Cola, as well as a skin tightening technique based on the principles of the accordion cool. The website I got all this information from is www.pri.org. Pri spelled P-R-I.